Hello everyone and welcome back to Beware the Q. This is just a quick disclaimer to let you know that the following video isn't new content, but is instead a compilation of old material, specifically my All Tomorrow's Theory videos. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like the video, leave a comment, share it around, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and become a member or patron if you're feeling generous. Now, let's get into the video.
We only know a few things about the Killer Folk, who were first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows. We know that they began life as star people, who themselves were created by Earth and Mars scientists in the 31st century. We know that the Q conquered and genetically modified the star people of this world into the human predators. And we know that after the Q left and many hundreds of thousands of years had passed, the human predators evolved into the Killer Folk, an intelligent and sapient race. But most of what happened between their first emerging as the Killer Folk and their eventual founding of the Second Galactic Empire, along with the Satyriacs, is a mystery. We know their beginnings, and we know their end. But what was the Killer Folk's homeworld like in the intervening millennia? So we first have them as human predators. This would have been their prehistory era. After this, they would likely have progressed in a similar manner to their ancestors, the Homo sapiens, and would have made their way through equivalents of the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Medieval period and Middle Ages, to name a few, eventually reaching a technological age, and then after that progressing in ways we can't yet imagine. Hunting and killing were extremely important to the Killer Folk, and according to the book, many of their religions allowed for sacred periods of hunting one another and engaging in duels to the death. So with this in mind, we can assume that for the longest time, theirs was a world of extreme violence. Throughout their history, they must have been some of the best swordsmiths and gunsmiths that the galaxy had ever seen, and that was only during their early history. Their early civilizations would have centered around killing, hunting, and dueling. It could be theorized that death in combat during these times was the most sought-after demise, much like the ancient Vikings of old Earth. The Vikings believed that brave warriors who died in battle stood a greater chance of getting into Valhalla, their idea of heaven. It could be that the Killer Folk had similar ideas, and in some of their religions, dying in combat could have been their ticket to a splendorous afterlife. It would be around this time that the hunter nobilities mentioned in the book began to emerge. A few thousand years later, some countries on this world could have grown to become similar to ancient Rome, with gladiatorial games, competing and spectating, being the #1 pastime. Later on, their world might have developed into a society resembling the Wild West of old Earth, where the killers now resembled fanged, high-tech cowboys. An age-old Killer Folk tradition might involve parents taking their children out, once they'd reached a certain age, to hunt down and kill their first victims, a fellow student in their school that they didn't get along with, perhaps. When one child killed another, the family of the fallen, while acknowledging that what had transpired was just a part of everyday life here and not having any personal feelings of ill will towards their child's killer, would then be duty-bound to engage in a long, bitter and bloody feud with the family of the victorious child. These ideas would probably have persisted throughout the millennia for much of their species' time in existence, and not just during ancient times. Killing was of such psychological importance to them that even in their more modern times and even into their highly advanced stages of technological development, killing was still perfectly acceptable in certain circumstances. It could be that professional disagreements in the workplace would be resolved by a duel, or promotions were handed out to the survivors of workplace brawls. Moving on from the Wild West and modern eras, the Killer Folk would have mastered space travel many centuries later, and would perhaps start to behave in a manner similar to the Yautja, aka the Predators from the popular Predator film series. The killers may have begun satiating their murderous urges on other planets, perhaps even travelling to the worlds of other future humans in an effort to capture and kill more exotic prey. Could there have been killer folk households with, for example, pterosapien or tall breeder trophies hanging on the walls of their studies or living rooms? If the killer folk had begun voyaging across space in large hunting parties, it could be that they had reached and invaded the Bugfacer's homeworld. The Bugfacers were notoriously xenophobic due to what is described in the book as another alien invasion occurring. The alien author, a billion years in the future, doesn't have all the details and is speculating on what happened. What if it wasn't an alien invasion but was in fact a killer folk invasion that took place, with the Bugfacers simply believing them to be aliens as they had never seen them before? This might also account for the Bugfacers' apprehension and 40 million year delay in joining the Second Galactic Empire, an empire that was co-founded by the Killer Folk. Even after all this time, these events would still be a sore spot for the Bugfacers, and they still couldn't fully trust the Killer Folk after what they had done. The Killers had, after all, arrived on their planet and started hunting them down one by one, for sport. Perhaps it would be these events and the interstellar conflicts and diplomatic problems that arose that would be the catalyst for the Killer Folk in some regions deciding that they needed to change their ways lest they become the most hated race in the galaxy. Even with their level of technology and with the immense space-age weaponry that they had developed over many thousands of years, they were wise enough to know that making interstellar enemies was not a good idea. Killing was okay for them, but they were starting to see and appreciate the fact that the same attitude was not held on other future human worlds. It was around this time that tensions began to grow and boil over on their homeworld. Much of the population was growing weary of their old ways and wanted to become a world of peace and enlightenment instead. The other factions, however, wanted to keep their killing traditions alive. A world war almost broke out, and the irony of having to kill to stop killing was not lost on the peaceful side of the Killer Folk population. The anti-killing pacifists had plans, big plans. They wanted to found an empire of peace, of which other worlds could freely join if they wished to do so. There had even been peaceful contact with another civilization known as the Satyriacs, who, as it turned out, shared their ancestry of originally being star people who were modified by the conquering Q. Fortunately for the Killer Folk, this cataclysmic world war which threatened to destroy them all was averted, with both sides, while heavily disagreeing on the correct way forward, both knew that a suicidal world war was not the way to go. Being mere minutes away from a world war had shaken everyone to the core. It was time for peace. No more killing, no more duels, no more wars. Killing had finally been made illegal across the majority of their world, but of course, underground hunts, duels and ritual murders were still practiced in some dark and seedy corners of the larger cities. But on the whole, the Killer Folk had made it. They founded the empire, known as the Second Galactic Empire, along with their interstellar cousins, the Satyriacs. It was an empire that lasted 80 million years, of which their progress in all areas couldn't even be imagined by 21st century humans. It would seem, however, that with war not being a concept they wished to engage in anymore, they were left somewhat vulnerable to attack. The Gravitals, a former human species who had left behind their organic bodies and modified themselves into machines, believed themselves to be the true heirs to the Star People and took it upon themselves to wipe out all other future humans. The Killer Folk, no longer the fierce warriors they had been all those millions of years ago, didn't stand a chance and were made extinct. All Tomorrows has one of the most active and passionate fandoms online, consisting of many talented people who spend some of their free time crafting and creating some amazing works of art relating to this incredible story of speculative evolution, including fanfics, illustrations, short animations, and original future human species concepts. There have also been a number of All Tomorrows memes floating around the internet, and the majority have come about over the past few months, with many people, including myself, getting their introduction to All Tomorrows from the Alt-Shift-X YouTube video, which gave everyone an introductory, abridged version of the story. Now, the purpose of this video today is to address something that I've noticed in quite a few fan-made animations and illustrations while perusing YouTube, and that's the way in which the Q's method of genetically modifying other life forms is often portrayed. So, more often than not, the way the Q genetically engineer the Star People in the majority of fan-made media is to simply inject the end of their tail into their unfortunate victim, and the recipient of the tail injection then simply morphs into something else. And the other thing I've noticed is that a lot of the time the victims of the Q will be sort of knocked out by the tail injection, and then that same individual will wake up as a colonial or a mantelope or something. Now, I'm not criticising these portrayals, and for all I know this could in fact be how the process works. It's not specifically stated in the book how it all goes down when the Q get to work on genetically modifying their victims, but to me I've always thought that this method of changing each individual one by one into a new form would be quite inefficient, extremely time consuming, and also not really how genetically engineering an entire species would work. And again, for all I know, that could be in fact how the Q go about their bizarre work, and unless CM Kozeman himself ever addresses this and provides a definitive answer, we may never know for certain. And once again, the purpose of this video is not to diss the work of the animators or any other creators. I know a lot of time and effort went into these videos, and I'm not taking anything away from them. In fact, I'll link the shown videos in the description so you can check them out for yourselves, as they are very cool. Now, for me, when I first read the book, a tail injection and an individual morphing into a new form wasn't at all what I imagined. I really don't think that any of the early post-Q species like the human predators, the mantelopes or the hand flappers ever actually were Star People themselves, but are in fact highly modified clones which were given all kinds of new features and attributes in a sort of gigantic laboratory setting, maybe on an off-world Q ship, or maybe inside one of the pyramid structures they're so fond of leaving on the worlds they visit. What I personally think would be more in line with what we know about the Q is that once they've attacked, conquered and taken over a world inhabited by the Star People, they would probably exterminate most of them and then round up a certain number of them and transport them elsewhere, either to a ship or one of the pyramids. Then, when the necessary number of subjects has been attained, probably only a few being needed, the Q would then begin to harvest their DNA, and then, using this DNA, they would mass produce the new genetically engineered life forms. Once they had what they needed from the imprisoned Star People, they would most likely dispose of them as they were no longer needed. That's how I feel it would have happened. I don't think any individual star person would have been knocked unconscious and then when they wake up they're one of the new forms that we meet in the book. Now, I know that in the Colonials' case, their fate was very much an act of punishment by the Q, but we have to try and imagine it from the Q's perspective. They're angry, they're outraged, they're deeply offended. This particular world of Star People had driven them back twice, and they're feeling pretty humiliated by that. This individual world has a race of people that they now want to make really suffer, but I think it's a case of the Q tarring everybody from this world with the same brush. Any heavily modified clones of these people that the Q create, in their minds, are still belonging to this race of people. On this planet, they are their clones, they are them. So the Colonials, again, were not Star People themselves, but are taken from Star People DNA, which was then genetically modified, and then they were allowed to grow into this new horrific form. As an example, some people, if they're wronged by an individual belonging to a certain group or demographic, for instance a teenager, they may then grow to hate all teenagers, or old people, or BMW drivers. It really doesn't matter, but that's how some people's minds work. The Q would be extremely self-centered as a species, with a god complex to end all god complexes, and when the Star People of this world fought back and deeply offended them, they developed a particularly strong hatred for the Star People of this world. So when the Q were creating new forms from their DNA, the new forms in the Q's eyes were also from this world. They originated from this world, they're of the same stock, and so it was them who were made to truly suffer because they were them, even though these newly created individuals had nothing to do with the initial resistance as they didn't exist at the time, but they're part of the same group, so they must suffer. There's also the question of how could the Colonials truly suffer if they weren't actually the people who engaged in the resistance and have never experienced life in a more human physical form? Well, my answer to that is, with the Q's capacity for cruelty having no bounds, they may have begun teaching and showing the first few generations of Colonials all about their past and why they were being forced to live like this. Their cognitive faculties had been retained, and so they would have been able to understand what the Q were teaching them, meaning that even though they had never lived any other kind of life, they would still know how utterly awful their lives were. So this is just going to be a quick video about a thought that occurred to me earlier today, and it's something that may be of slight interest to you if you're as interested in All Tomorrow's lore as I am. So basically, I was just wondering how the Q actually came to be known as the Q. How did they get their name? Because it seems like in universe that's what they're known as, but how exactly would they have communicated the name of their species to the Star People? Now the first idea I had, which is possibly the more sensible one, is that the name Q perhaps comes from a vocalization that the Q make, sort of like a repeating noise that sounds like Q Q Q, and that's how they came to be known as the Q by the Star People. Like the name is an onomatopoeia because the Star People had no other reference point from which to name the Q. They didn't know where they came from or really anything about them at all, so this is what they became known as. They're an intelligent species and they have mouths, so spoken languages are certain to have occurred in their early history, but whether they still have any need for that at this highly advanced stage is unknown. If they don't speak to each other vocally anymore, it could be that they now communicate using obscure movements of their wings. As being the superior gods that they consider themselves to be, they probably wouldn't want to use a form of communication that could be easily deciphered by lesser beings. There is power in secrecy, as you all know. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Back to the theories. So QQQ vocalizations was the first theory that I came up with, but there are definitely other possibilities. The second one is that despite their incredibly alien appearance, the Q actually do speak conventionally, and possessing unimaginable intelligence, are capable of quickly learning and deciphering the languages of lesser evolved life forms like humans. It could be that upon first learning of the Star People's existence, the Q quickly deciphered and learned their language, which would be a future version of whatever Earth or Mars language the Star People were speaking at the time. After analysing the Star People's communication from afar and learning the humans' language, the Q, being godlike and probably wanting to make a dramatic entrance with lots of grandeur when they first meet the Star People, would have directly spoken to those who greeted them and introduced themselves as the Q. They would have met the leaders of the world they were invading and told them simply, "We are the Q and your world is now ours," but, you know, not worded in such an amateurish way. I admit it may seem a little bit silly and cheesy to imagine the Q talking and having conversations with humans, given the image that we have of them at the moment, but it does still seem like a possibility to me. The third theory is that Q actually means something in the language of the alien author who's chronicling the events a billion years later. Maybe Q in the alien author's language just means invaders or aliens or conquerors or something like that, and that's a name that he has attributed to them. Maybe the Q in their entire species' existence never actually referred to themselves as the Q at all and were called something else entirely in their lifetime. It could also be that in the course of the alien author's research, he spent time studying the pyramid structures that the Q left behind. Much like the pyramids in Egypt on old Earth, they may have contained something similar to hieroglyphics, and the alien author decoded it and came across the name Q, which would again mean that this was a name that the Q gave themselves and would mean something in their language. Maybe Q means God in their language or something like that. Those are just a few ideas I came up with. No doubt there are tons of others that I haven't thought of. Be sure to let me know in the comments what your theories are regarding how the Q came to be known as the Q. It'll be really interesting to see what you come up with. So following on from the previous video titled The Martians Explained, today we're going to be taking a more in-depth look into what exactly may have ultimately become of Earth and Mars in the All Tomorrows universe. Now in the section of All Tomorrows entitled Earth Rediscovered, we learn that 560 million years in the future, Earth still exists and was rediscovered by a researcher who belonged to an unknown future human species. It wasn't a huge deal when the planet of origin was rediscovered and was only seen as a somewhat interesting piece of trivia among the future humans who were by now over 500 million years removed from Earth and obviously had no real ties to the place. There had also been a great deal of incredible and unimaginable advances and accomplishments made by this point, and the rediscovery of Earth wasn't really up there with things such as the ability to utilise wormholes for intergalactic travel or re-encountering and defeating the Q. So when Earth was rediscovered by the future researcher, it didn't really make any waves. It wasn't a huge deal. There was no sentient life left there anyway. However, However, in the image provided we can see that there is still plant life and water, and therefore the conditions for terrestrial life are still present. There are, however, no humans to be seen. The book doesn't make any mention of any wild animal life being present, but it can be assumed that there is still wild species on Earth, as it is described as having gone feral. We can also assume that at this point in time, Mars is in a similar condition to Earth, overgrown, feral, and no humans around. So this begs the question of what exactly happened to the Earth people and the Martians. After the Star People were created and went off to colonize the galaxy, Earth and Mars were left behind. In the previous video, I went into a little theory at the end where the citizens of Earth and Mars, not wanting to hinder the Star People or hold them back, simply stayed on their respective planets and didn't attempt to venture out any further, realizing that they were now obsolete life forms compared to the brilliant Star People. They had become enlightened and peace-loving, no longer engaging in wars and no longer having any desire to leave their worlds. This is just one theory of countless possibilities, however, and now I'm going to get into 3 other paths that the human race could have taken, which we'll call their good, neutral and bad endings. And of course it'll be fascinating to read your theories on what became of the old-style human race as well, so leave a comment below with your thoughts. I have no doubt that there will be some extremely interesting ideas and I look forward to reading them. But for now, let's take a look at 3 of my own theories. Let me know what you think. Good ending. Rather than becoming homebodies and staying on Earth and Mars for the rest of their existence, the now peace-loving human race decided that they would indeed still voyage out into the stars themselves and colonize new worlds. With the advent of the Star People, technologies that were designed by them were of course there to be freely used by the original human species as well. While it is stated in the book that the Star People were the ones to colonize our spiral arm of the Milky Way, that doesn't mean that the older version of humanity didn't do any further colonization of their own. They had managed to colonize Mars after all, and with access to Star People tech, they were more than capable of heading out into the void to find new suitable worlds to terraform and populate. They did this for many millions of years, and using the Star People's knowledge as a base, would then go on to make their own incredible advances in all areas which were uniquely theirs. They did not want to cause any suffering to any other living things, and so they would always make sure that any potential worlds suitable for human settlement contained no intelligent life. They never found any intelligent alien life anyway, and so they were able to populate an untold number of moons and planets, and would eventually evolve to the level of attaining interdimensional travel. They would survive and thrive, and were able to outlive the Star People before disappearing into the unknown, another plane of existence that we couldn't possibly comprehend. Neutral ending. In the neutral ending, the human races living on Earth and Mars continue on for many millions of years, but with so much time having passed and many millions of years of natural disasters having taken place, they had completely forgotten much of their history and had no knowledge of the Star People or their past Earth-Mars war. The people of Earth believe that they have always been on Earth, and the people of Mars believe that they have always been on Mars. The two peoples have completely diverged, and while they have remained aware of each other's existence, the majority of people on both worlds don't believe that they're related to each other, with only a handful of free thinkers theorizing that this may be the case. These free thinkers are, however, generally scoffed at by the public at large and the scientific communities on both planets, who dismiss them as conspiracy theorists. There is no evidence for the people of the two planets having any shared ancestry, and so it cannot be true. Any small scraps of evidence that are uncovered by renegade researchers are quickly lost or go missing, indicating that a cover-up by their leaders is in play. By this point, there have been so many new religions that have sprung up over the millennia that they are now so deeply entrenched into people's psyches that the truth coming out about Earth and Mars having shared origins would send much of the population into an existential crisis, and anarchy would ensue. Earth and Mars both resemble present-day Earth in some ways, and it seems that they are doomed to repeat history once again, going through everything that their ancestors from millions of years before them, i.e. us, had to go through, and the cycle continues again and again for millions and millions of years. Eventually, the two human species, who are now completely different in almost every way, do what humans do best and go to war with one another, over religious differences, not to mention the drastic physical differences. Humanity is wiped out by the war, and while this may seem like a horrible end to humanity, extinction-level events are a common occurrence throughout the universe, and this was just one of countless trillions to have taken place since the very first life forms ever came into existence. These two species were also watched over by the ever-neutral Asteromorphs, who again were believed by the scientific communities of both planets to be make-believe, with those who believed in them as gods eventually coming to be described as crackpots, after a so-called progressive wave of thought had overtaken their cultures. The Asteromorphs had allowed the people of Earth and Mars to do what they will, only ever watching and never interfering. After many millions of years of existence, they were now gone, having died out naturally from the effects of warfare. Bad ending. The Q, for millions of years, had been sweeping through the cosmos, capturing and genetically modifying any and all life forms they found. Eventually they found their way to our galaxy, where they set about changing the star people who had by this point terraformed and colonised much of our spiral arm of the galaxy. With the Q now working their way through all of these star people inhabited planets, it was only a matter of time before they reached Earth and Mars. They occupied the same spiral arm, after all. The star people had attempted to fight back against the Q, with some succumbing to them straight away, and others managing to hold them off for a short while. But eventually, in less than 1,000 years, they would all fall to the invading menace. The older version of humanity, on Earth and Mars, didn't stand a chance. The Q took hold of all life, all of humanity on Earth and Mars, and changed it. Into what exactly we do not know, but if the future human species we do know about are anything to go by, then it would have likely been unpleasant. The Q were not just a far-off menace that changed the life forms of other planets far away in deep space. No, they would also be coming here, and there wasn't a thing that humanity could do to stop them. When the Q made their way through our spiral arm of the galaxy, they did so with the intention of capturing and genetically modifying any and all life forms that they discovered, and the star people, who were originally created by humans to colonize the galaxy, were the beginning of most of the Q-created new species that we meet over the course of all tomorrows. It is stated in the section entitled Colonials that the aforementioned species, who resemble sheets of human flesh with eyes and other human orifices and appendages, had put up one hell of a fight against the invaders. For this, they were severely punished, being transformed into what is arguably the most horrific form of future human that we're presented with in the book. So bearing in mind that the star people who had the audacity to fight back were awarded a truly nightmarish fate, it can be theorised that the other worlds that perhaps didn't fight back or surrender to the Q straight away may have been the ones to be remade into comparatively more preferable forms. When you look at a future human species like the hedonists or the fingerfishers, for example, you can see that their new existence of lazing around on beaches catching fish or becoming pampered pets that the Q would look after could have been decided on by the Q based on how much resistance they were met with upon arrival. So while the previously mentioned examples could be elaborated on much further, in this video we'll be examining the Ruin Haunters in particular, and also theorising on why exactly the Q left them pretty much intact for the most part. As can be seen in the illustration, the Ruin Haunters still look remarkably human, at least when compared to the Mantelopes or the Worms, and they were also left with a vast amount of technology which for some reason the Q didn't completely eradicate. On all of the other worlds that the Q are known to have visited, the only things that they are believed to have left behind are gigantic mile-high pyramids and the modified life forms themselves. So why did they, on this planet, leave behind so much technology? It wasn't just Q tech that was left behind either, as it states in the book that much of what remained was built by the Star People. I do have a theory as to why this may have occurred, and why the Ruin Haunters didn't have as much taken away from them by the Q as some of the other world's inhabitants did. So going back to the hedonists, this future human species was designed for a life of immense pleasure by the Q. They didn't have to do anything except lounge around all day, get fed by their owners, and mates with each other. The ideal life, really. On the flip side, the Colonials' life was a living hell because they had fought back. This would likely mean that the hedonists, in their past life as Star People, perhaps didn't fight back at all, and instead they quickly and quietly surrendered. Maybe they knew that to go up against the Q was futile. Maybe the star people of this world already knew about the Q because the Q had already visited other colonized worlds that they were in contact with, and these star people had gotten wind of what was happening to the people there. So when the Q showed up on their doorstep, they probably just threw their hands up immediately and decided to take their lumps. But in not daring to try and fight them off, they were granted a much lighter sentence. They were made into their new pets instead of being made into their new sewage processing system. Maybe it was by being subservient and recognizing the Q as the all-powerful gods that they considered themselves to be, that they would curry favor with them and be granted a much nicer future existence. They were, however, not left with any old technology, and once the Q had left their world for another, they had to start the evolutionary process from scratch. Now, when we look at the Ruin Haunters, we see that they still looked quite human-like, but unlike the hedonists, they were left with a great deal of ancient technology. Why were those who were granted long lives of pleasure not also provided with clues to their old lives for when they eventually regained their sentience, as the Q certainly knew that they eventually would if left to their own devices? Well, my theory on why the Ruin Haunters got to keep their old technology, dear viewer, is thus. The Ruin Haunters' ancestors, like the hedonists' ancestors, had surrendered to the Q straight away, but the Ruin Haunters' ancestors didn't just surrender to them. They may have gone one step further and done something else for the Q so as to gain their favour and hopefully not receive any genetic modifications. Maybe the star people of this world, who would become the Ruin Haunters, sold out their fellow man to the Q in hopes of getting away unscathed. Picture this. The star people of the soon-to-be colonial world had fought off the Q and forced them to retreat twice. We know that they would, however, succumb to a third Q invasion. What if the pre-Ruin Haunter star people had agreed to work with the Q in some way to show them the weak points in the soon-to-be colonials' defences, revealing to them that they had been going about their previous assaults in the wrong way, and that's why they had been beaten back 2 times before. In hopes of being on the winning side when all was said and done, these star people had sided with the Q, and so were partially responsible for many of the other human worlds falling to them. These cowards, these pathetic wretches, genuinely believed that they would remain unharmed if they cozied up to the Q. Perhaps the Q had in some way made promises to leave them be if they aided them in achieving their ends, but of course the Q, once these star people had outlived their usefulness, went back on their promise. The Q did indeed change these people into the Ruin Haunters, but with their own strange sense of justice, decided to let them off easy. They were still going to modify them because it was what they did, it was kind of their thing, but they would allow them to retain a mostly human appearance. They wouldn't dull their minds to the point that they couldn't regain their sentience, and they wouldn't take away their technology. They were being rewarded in a way. They would certainly re-evolve to become intelligent beings, and the Q would allow them to do this, as they indeed saw themselves as just and fair gods. The Q had no problem with intelligent sapient species, as long as they were intelligent and sapient species made by them. When the Q took over a planet that was inhabited by star people, their main objective was to change the locals on a genetic level. This was something they easily managed, and what resulted was a myriad of bizarre forms. They did this because they were offended by the star people's terraforming activities, and also because they considered themselves to be the only ones worthy of changing worlds. This was work to be undertaken by gods, and not these lowly infidels. The Q didn't just have one redesign in mind, however, when it came to genetically modifying their prisoners. In this video, we'll be taking a look at some of the Q's initial creations, the first 5 post-human species that we meet in the book, and trying to figure out why exactly they made the specific changes that they made, and why the redesigns between these new species vary so greatly. There must have been specific reasons for these particular modifications being decided on, and we'll now be putting ourselves into the mindset of the Q to try and figure out what those reasons might be. While the book sometimes gives us a few small tidbits of information about a particular planet a species lives on, it's usually left pretty obscure, and so a few of the settings I've come up with are my own inventions, so please bear this in mind. Anyway, let's get started with the worms. The worms planet is said to be an absolute scorcher, a baking hot desert world where life can only survive underground. It's stated in the book that through Q intervention, the heat was turned up considerably. What if this world was already rather hot when the Q arrived? They may have increased increased its overall temperature artificially using their unimaginable technology, but before they arrived it was a world comparable in climate to the desert states of the USA or the Gobi Desert. When the Q arrived, they noticed that the Star People had terraformed it to a degree, but would spend their time living inside of cities contained within gigantic cooling bubbles, which housed a more pleasant artificial climate and made for a much more comfortable existence for the world's citizens. The Q may have been amused when they saw this. It was not just the Star People's comparatively primitive technology that the Q found laughable, but also that they had chosen to colonize a world that they could not comfortably live on. Well, we'll soon fix that, they thought. If you're going to live on a desert world, we'll make it so that you can actually live on it. And so, once the Q had swiftly invaded and taken over the planet, they would modify these Star People into the worms. Now they really could inhabit the desert world that they had chosen to live on, and they could do it properly. Secondly, we have the Titans. When the Q arrived on this planet, which would soon become home to the Titans, they saw that the Star People of this world were quite fond of large structures, with towering skyscrapers up to 5 miles high being a common sight on this world. It was a cultural thing. The planet was also littered with mile-high statues of notable people from their past, brilliant individuals from history who had propelled them into the golden age that they were currently experiencing, but was soon to come to an abrupt end. The Q saw these megastructures and thought these beings wished themselves bigger. Why would they build these grotesquely gigantic buildings when they could comfortably fit inside of a dwelling the size of a prison cell? Well, if they wish to be Titans, we'll grant them their wish. And so, upon capture, the people of this world were made into the enormous creatures named the Titans that we meet in the book, but not before their beloved skyscrapers and incredible feats of architecture were easily toppled by the Q before their very eyes, and replaced by the miles-high pyramids that the Q were so fond of leaving on their conquered worlds. The Q needed to show these beings what true megastructures were, and they did just this, before permanently genetically modifying them into titanic 30-meter-long behemoths. Third, we have the predators and the prey. By looking through the genes of the Star People of this world, the Q were able to map with 100% accuracy the entire history of human evolution, from its beginnings as a single-celled organism to its current form as a spacefaring human being. Such was the extent of the Q's technology. They could see it all. One particular period took the Q's fancy while perusing the library that was the Homo sapiens' genetic makeup, and that was what we call the Paleolithic period. Human beings lived in caves and were hunter-gatherers. What an intriguing prospect, thought the Q. They were savages back then, but when we found them, they were savages who cloaked their primitive society in a veil of civilization. Animals who had somehow gotten the idea that they were more than that. They shouldn't lie to themselves, they shouldn't delude themselves, thought the Q. And so with this in mind, the Q decided to make these people's outside appearance match their true essence, primitive beasts. And so these people were given exaggerated animal features, with some becoming predators and others becoming prey. You should thank us, thought the Q. We have allowed you to become your true selves. Next up is the Mantelopes. The Mantelopes were bred as singers and memory retainers. They acted as living hard drives during the Q's reign. Their fate was a particularly cruel one, as they were basically reduced to the level of lesser evolved animals physically, yet still retained the minds of human beings. When the Q arrived on this world, they discovered this particular Star People culture to be one of practicality and free expression, a society where individualism was of high importance. On other worlds, this was of course accepted, as the Star People knew that allowing each individual to do things their own way was paramount to continued development, but here on this world it was of the highest priority. It was integral to their cultural identity. These were people who, above all, liked to get things done, and in their own way. The Q, knowing this to be cherished above all else, decided to take it away from them. They could sing, but only for the Q. They would be living memory banks of incredible knowledge, but only of knowledge which the Q deemed important. When the Q left, the Mantelopes were lost. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't fix their world, which they so sorely wished to do, but their animal bodies wouldn't allow it. Yet they could still express themselves, something they loved to do in their past lives as Star People, but now all they could express was sorrow and misery. Luckily for them, their animal form would eventually overshadow their human minds, which would in time grow dull, and then then their sapience would be forever lost. Finally, we have the swimmers. It's stated in the book that the swimmers' creation was likely due to the Q having an aquatic larval stage in their early development, but this may not be the only reason. It could be that this planet was a water world of sorts, perhaps with even less landmass than Earth, and almost completely covered in ocean. Much like the worms on that baking hot desert planet, it could be that the Q were puzzled, or amused, by the fact that these people had chosen to live on a planet that was generally unsuitable to their lifestyle. With this being an ocean planet, perhaps with some artificially created land that was terraformed by the Star People, the Q decided that they would force the inhabitants to live within the planet's defining feature, and so the swimmers were created. Now, these were just some theories on why the Q decided to make these particular changes to these particular Star People, and these were only the first 5 or 6 species from the book as well. The only official illustration we have of a Q specimen shows that they are a strange bug-like species and possess characteristics that are typically associated with insects. They have pincer-like mandibles, eyes that sit on the ends of optical stalks, and of course they have wings. They're not entirely insect-like, however, as they don't have any legs at all, let alone 6. This makes them unlike any creature we know of on Earth, as there doesn't seem to be anything here that has wings but no legs, at least not according to my research. But this is hardly surprising, as the Q are aliens, and they're also aliens that have performed extensive genetic engineering on themselves to boot. This means that the Q most likely look quite different to how they would have looked had they just evolved naturally without artificially enhancing themselves. Building on this, it occurred to me that while we use the example that we're given in All Tomorrows as a representation of how the Q race looked as a whole, it is unlikely that every single Q individual would have looked like this. And I don't just mean slight physical differences between individuals, as is the case with human beings, but I'm actually thinking more along the lines of different classes of Q having very different physical attributes to best suit their role within their society. In the illustration we're given, this Q specimen is shown holding the Vitruvian Man, a representation of humanity, upside down and clutching a weapon with its long prehensile tail. This could be looked at in 2 different ways. 1, this illustration depicts a Q soldier or drone which was used for initial invasions, or 2, this illustration depicts a Q who is more representative of the upper echelons of their society. Personally, I'm of the opinion that this Q is a soldier. My reason for thinking this is that it has a number of physical attributes that would be ideal for combat situations. The main one being that they have wings and can fly. This gives them numerous advantages over terrestrial beings, such as Star People, as their options for subduing an enemy are greatly multiplied. They can swoop down at them, grab them and then drop them from a great height. They can move in any direction to evade an attack, etc. Their tails are also extremely versatile and, as we can see in the image, capable of wielding and using weapons, though whether this is a Q weapon or a human weapon that it has relieved its human opponent of is unknown. Another reason I think that this image shows a Q soldier or drone is the fact that it seems as if it can only fly, and with no legs, like I said earlier, it would have to remain constantly hovering, constantly flapping its wings, and therefore using a lot of energy. This doesn't seem like an efficient way of living day to day, constantly burning energy and not being able to land and walk around to conserve said energy. Therefore, I think that this design would be reserved for those who would need it most, Q soldiers or drones, or any individual that would require a lot of mobility. Once they had done what they needed to do, they would be recalled and then placed into hibernation or stasis, and then brought out of it when they were needed again. The Q are masters of genetic engineering, and so I would think that they would have efficiency on their minds at all times when designing and redesigning themselves. So knowing this, I think it's quite possible that the Q who didn't require a great amount of mobility would have looked a bit different to the one that we've seen. Maybe their appearance is similar, but instead of having 4 wings, they instead have 4 legs, or 6 legs. Perhaps there were some with as many legs as a centipede, though I really hope that isn't the case. I also feel that relative to the rest of the Q's body as depicted in the book, its head isn't that big and doesn't seem like it would have room for a large, highly evolved brain. While it could be argued that they have simply found a way to condense their brains down for efficiency reasons and so that they're carrying less weight while flying around all over the place, I feel that maybe the Q drones simply had smaller brains which were capable of taking orders and acting out whatever they needed to do while taking over an alien world. But the real thinking was done by their superiors, who had larger brains planes and a different physical appearance, a design that we're currently not privy to, but is there behind the scenes directing the drones and using them to do their bidding. At the end of All Tomorrows, we're informed that the United Galaxies, of which the human-derived Asteromorph civilization was a prominent member, had re-encountered and subdued the Q. By this point, it seems that the Asteromorphs had overtaken the Q in many ways, in a technological sense, as well as in sheer number as well, and they are said to have spread themselves far and wide across the galaxy and had also formed an alliance with a completely alien and non-human derived species known as the Amphicephali. The fact that they had managed to subdue the Q is interesting because it means that a reign of terror that had lasted close to 2 billion years, an absolutely unimaginable amount of time, had come to an end. We aren't provided with any detail about the Q's ultimate fate, however, and so it's left to the imagination of the reader to decide what happened to them in the end, at the hands of the Asteromorphs and the rest of the new empire. Now in this video we'll just be taking a look at a few of the ways it could have gone. There are some theories out there about the Q actually being future humans themselves who had mastered time travel, which many people agree with, and there is also my cringy early video, The Q Explained, in which I theorised that the Q may have been imprisoned for their crimes against humanity, but ultimately managed to escape their bondage and then wipe out the Asteromorphs and the rest of the Empire for good, which very few people agree with. In this video, however, we'll be keeping things simple and going with a linear timeline which is comprised only of the events that we know definitely happened, up to the point of the Empire having subdued the Q. So the Q were defeated. What happened next? What happened to the Q? What did the Asteromorphs decide to do with them? Some say that the Asteromorphs killed every single one of them, and that the Q as a species were made extinct. Sure, the Empire had managed to defeat them and take away their power, but they were likely too dangerous to be allowed to live. The Asteromorphs had previously defeated the Machine Empire, made up of varying forms of gravital, and rather than destroy every single one of them, they decided to keep some of them around and reprogram them. They saw them as being too useful to get rid of completely, as they would make excellent tools of the Empire. A living machine could go places and do things that an organic, even one as advanced as an astromorph, could not. So the so-called new machines were integrated into the Empire, albeit as citizens lower down on the ladder than the organic members. The Q, however, were not machines, unlike the gravital. They were also now inferior to the Astros in a technological sense, meaning that they wouldn't have any really useful knowledge to impart. They, like the Asteromorphs and the Amphicephali, were organic, and so not useful as tools like the new machines. What use would the Q be to the Empire? The most likely answer is they would be of no use whatsoever. All they were was an extremely dangerous enemy, now powerless, but too dangerous to be allowed to live. This would mean that they probably just decided to put the Q down for good, thus bringing to an end the species' time in existence. The second way it could have gone would be that if the Empire was a democratic one, they may have put the Q on trial for their crimes against humanity. Now, in my opinion, this is unlikely. Everything that was done to the Star People was done hundreds of millions of years before, and unless the Q have an extraordinarily long lifetime, then not a single Q individual at the time of their subjugation would have had anything to do with those events. That would be like putting a pigeon on trial today because its dinosaur ancestors killed other kinds of dinosaurs all those millions of years ago. Completely asinine. But let us not forget that for all of their evolution, the Asteromorphs are still descended from humans, and you should never underestimate the level of bureaucratic idiocy that humans are capable of, not to mention the strong desire to punish members of groups for things that either other members of their group have done or that their distant ancestors did. History is rife with this stuff. And so, while I think it's unlikely that the Asteromorphs would put the Q on trial for what their species had done in the past, it still seems like something of a possibility because humans love nonsense, though I would hope that the Astros had eventually evolved beyond that tendency. And if the result of their trial is a verdict of guilty, which of course it would be, then the Q would have been sentenced to death anyway. The third way that things could have played out was that the Asteromorphs decided to inflict on the Q what had been done to their human ancestors all those tens of millions of years ago, and genetically modify them into new forms. This seems to be a popular line of thinking among
among the online All Tomorrow's fandom, but to be perfectly honest, and this may upset or enrage some people, I disagree with this. I actually don't think that the Asteromorphs would have done this to the Q at all. My reasoning for this is thus. When the Q modified humanity, they did it for a variety of nutty religious reasons. They believed that they were gods and the only ones who had the divine right to change worlds and organic species. The Asteromorphs, on the other hand, don't hold any insane beliefs like the Q did, or at least there's no indication of this anywhere in the book. So if the Asteros did genetically modify the Q after they'd managed to subdue them, the only reason for this would be to get revenge on them for stuff that happened millions and millions of years ago. This just seems really petty to me. The Asteromorphs are godlike themselves and would have long since achieved a level of enlightenment that could never be achieved by any lesser evolved human forms. Why would such an advanced species made up of gods resort to petty measures like this? Like, you did it to us, now we'll do it to you. The whole thing just seems really small-minded to me, and it seems like these would be the actions of a much less mature species. And that's why I disagree with the idea that the Q would have been modified after they'd been captured. I really don't think the Asteromorphs would reduce themselves to such childish tit-for-tat. I think that if the Q were captured and remained in the Asteromorphs' custody, that the Astros would probably have made the simple, cold, logical decision to quickly kill them off and then move on to more important things. But what do you guys think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Sound off in the comments section and let me know what you think.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. In today's video we'll be talking about the fingerfishers and their later form, the Sail People. So the Sail People, a variety of future human from all tomorrows, seem to be one of the more overlooked species, not mentioned very often, with a lot of attention instead being given to, for example, the Snake People, the Killer Folk, and the big bads like the Gravital and the Q. The poor old Sail People rarely get a mention, however, and this is quite strange in a way because the Sail People are an extremely interesting species for a number of reasons. They're not quite aquatic like the tall breeders, and they're not quite aerial either like the Pterosapiens, even though they spend much of their time operating in waterways and also having wings. The Sail People, instead, glide along the surfaces of water bodies, snatching up fish with their long, demonic-looking tongues, which also act as their hands. Their actual hands are now their wings, which before that bore long hooked fingers which were used to pluck fish out of streams and rivers, back when they were a form known as the fingerfishers. The Sail People are pretty scary, to be perfectly honest, and with their elongated crocodilian snouts, long flickering tongues used as hands, and pterodactylian wings, they look to me like some sort of water demon. And in the caption below the image of the Sail People that we're provided with, it states that these people are extremely violent by nature, definitely not a species that I'd want to mess with. But this declaration of the sailors being extremely violent is interesting because their ancestors, the fingerfishers, were so peaceful. Their lives consisted of very little apart from milling about and catching fish with their hooked fingers. Yes, fishing is a form of hunting, but it's not terribly bloody or dangerous. It's quite intriguing that a species that had such a chilled out existence before would evolve into something that has to resort to savage hunting campaigns in its more so-called civilized form millions of years later to quell its bloodthirst. It's almost the exact opposite of every other species which started off savage and violent but becomes more peaceful later on. The Sail People started off peaceful but acquired a bloodlust. But why? I suppose it could be explained by the usual evolutionary process of survival of the fittest, with the most willing to fight and kill being the most likely to survive and breed. But why would the fingerfishers have any need to do this? They ate fish. Why kill each other? Maybe at some point the fish species on their world became endangered. The waters of their world could have been overfished, and so competition over food became more fierce, necessitating the need for the fingerfishers to begin fighting amongst themselves to acquire food. Or maybe this didn't happen, and their eventual turn towards a violent lifestyle is a result of them being based on human beings. Humans, it seems, can't really help but be a violent species, even when there's not really any need for it. In the book, it does state that many of the fingerfishers' descendants became other forms significantly different to the Sail People, and we're even provided with a glimpse of one of these forms in the illustration, showing what is described as a distant cousin of the Sail People. Whether this distant cousin of theirs is sapient with human level intelligence or not is unknown. It does show, however, that they would have had to contend with other beings that actually had the power of flight at some point in their history. So maybe the fingerfishers never had to compete amongst themselves, but had to compete with a divergent form related to themselves, but now different enough to be considered a separate species, hence the once peaceful fishers adopting a more brutal and violent lifestyle. But what do you guys think? I want to read your thoughts on why the fingerfishers left their peaceful ways behind and became the ferocious sail people.
Hey guys, so this video is probably going to be quite short and sweet, nothing too deep, but hopefully it'll be somewhat thought-provoking and it'll manage to spark a discussion down in the comment section. I'm hoping this video will get people talking and it will lead us to some really interesting takes and ideas. So basically, yesterday at work I was daydreaming, as I so often do when I'm at work, and I was trying to think of new ideas for videos, and then the thought popped into my head that the Second Galactic Empire in All Tomorrows was founded after first contact was established between just two of the future human species, those two being the Killer Folk and the Satyriacs. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Second Galactic Empire is an intergalactic federation made up of the worlds which are inhabited by the sapient, civilized, evolved forms of the animalistic future human species which were made by the Q. Now, I don't know why, but I find it quite appropriate that these two species, the Killers and the Satyriacs, would be the first to contact each other, and also the fact that they seem to have gotten along so well, or at the very least well enough to establish an alliance with each other. I feel that these two species probably have an awful lot in common with one another, in that they don't strike me as being, I suppose you could say, particularly inhibited. Now, what I mean by that is I feel like these two species would be highly in touch with what you could call their more primal instincts, in slightly different ways of course. So for example, it states in the book that the Killer Folk had a multitude of religions over their species' lifetime, and within those religions they would have had sacred times that were dedicated to things like murderous orgies that would be comprised of sex, death and prayer. It seems that the Killer Folk were very much in tune with their bloodlust and didn't really shy away from it the way we modern humans do, and it seems that even into their highly developed stages of civilization they still set aside times in which they could engage in ritualized hunts and killing games. The Satyriacs, on the other hand, were again highly in tune with their primal instincts, but, and this is just a guess, theirs would probably involve much less killing, though they would have, like the Killers, still been extremely fond of orgies, though the death aspect would be much less prevalent. Maybe it would have been there in some ways, as the Satyriacs strike me as being extremely free in their attitudes to such things, basically having a whatever floats your boat mentality. As long as it's all consensual, then you do you. You want to kill each other, go ahead, as long as everyone agrees to it. Now I know that by the time these two races were advanced enough to be able to contact one another, which was done long distance via radio communication by the way, they would likely have left a lot of this behaviour in the past, and the Killer Folk wouldn't do nearly as much killing by that point. But upon first contact with one another, I think that one of the first things that these two future human species would have discussed would have been their respective species' histories. Now I believe it says in the book that by this point the evolved sapient future human species, and not just the Killers and the Satyriacs but the others as well, so the Pterosapiens, the Saurosapiens, the tall breeders, etc., had all by this point learned all about or figured out their history. They've learned about the Star People and what happened with the Q, all of that. So they would probably have theorised that there were many others like them out there amongst the stars, and so when they received their initial first communication, whether it was the Killers contacting the Satyriacs or vice versa, they would have already known that the beings they were speaking to were in fact their distant cousins. So I think that's what their very first conversations would have been about, you know, their ancestors being these starfaring humans from millions of years ago. They originated on a planet that they called Earth, which at this point was lost and nobody knew exactly where it was. Oh, you're descended from Star People? Hey, us too, that's cool. Then they probably would have asked each other a lot of questions, like, have you seen any recent signs of the Q in your vicinity? Nope. What about you? Nope. Thank God. They would have, on each of their worlds, a lot of stuff that was left behind by the Q, notably their pyramid structures. The two species would have probably exchanged any information that they had gleaned from the ruins, anything that they had managed to decipher, to try and get a clearer picture of what happened all those millions of years ago. Once they had discussed the ancient Q and Star People at length and learned all that they could from one another about that subject, they would have moved on to other things, so along with learning about each other's history,
They would want to learn about each other's present, so they would have exchanged descriptions of their physical appearance and lifestyle, which in reality wasn't too different from one another, at least when you compare them to the snake people or the tool breeders, who were drastically different from their human ancestors, and from the killers and satyriacs too. The killers and satyriacs were both bipedal. They lived on dry land and not underwater or within tightly compacted tunnels like the snake people. They also didn't fly around in the sky like the Terra sapiens. So in a way, I suppose it would have been easier for these two future human species to be one another's first exposure to another future human race, as the culture shock, and undoubtedly there would have been a culture shock to some extent, it would be less so than if the killer folk's first exposure to other future humans was the snake people instead of the satyriacs. Now I know that the killers at this point were highly evolved and technologically way ahead of anything that we have currently, and of course they would have known that any beings that they meet could be extremely different to themselves. It would probably have been much easier for them to meet for the first time another species that had more similarities to themselves rather than differences, and maybe, possibly, the success of the Second Galactic Empire's founding could be due to this. You know, it would have eased them into it, so to speak. If their first contact was with a species that was drastically different to themselves, like the asymmetric people for example, maybe it would have been much harder for them to build that rapport, to establish a real connection, and so maybe the fact that the killer folk and the satyriacs had more similarities than differences, and they certainly would have had quite a few differences, maybe it was their mostly being similar that could be credited with the Second Galactic Empire being founded in the first place. Then, once they had gotten used to each other, meeting others that were even more different to themselves would have been much easier for them. Who exactly, or what exactly, is the alien author of All Tomorrows? I'm talking about this guy, by the way, not this guy. So, spoiler alert if you haven't yet read the book or listened to my audiobook reading, in the final chapter it's revealed that everything and everyone previously talked about in the story is long gone, and by long gone I mean they've been extinct for over 1 billion years. We're told this by the being who, in universe, wrote the book, known as the alien author, this strange looking chap. But who is this being? There's a few theories floating around on the internet, all of which are possibilities. Some say that the author is actually a highly evolved version of one of the species we meet in the book, with the majority of these people believing him and his species to in fact be descended from the Q. It's possible. I would say that there are a few loose similarities. The appendages coming from the top of the author's head, or at least I would assume that's his head, do resemble the Q's optical stalks. It could also be that the arm and hand that are seen grasping the human skull are actually derived from the Q's long prehensile tail. In both illustrations they're grasping something. In both illustrations they're facing the reader straight on. Maybe they were illustrated this way on purpose to demonstrate the parallels between these two possibly related species. Maybe when the Asteromorphs and the Second Galactic Empire eventually re-encountered and subdued the Q, as is stated towards the end of the book, the Empire genetically modified them into something else, as the Q had been doing to other species for an untold amount of time. If the Asteromorphs modified the Q into a sort of slug-like species, they may have, after 1 billion years or so, evolved to the point of becoming the race that the author belongs to. So perhaps the author isn't directly descended from the Q as we know them, but descended from the species that the Asteromorphs changed the Q into. Speaking of Asteromorphs, it's also possible that the author is actually descended from them. Again, when you look at the image of the later stage Asteromorph with the bizarre hypertrophied brain that has spread out from the sides of its head like wings, there are again similarities between the two images. Both facing the reader, both in possession of something. The author possesses a skull, and the Astro possesses a gravitar. I think this possession, as illustrated, is symbolic of humanity's dominion over all things. It could be that the author also has a brain that spreads outwards like this, as it's a distant descendant of the Astromorphs. It has, of course, shrunken down over the ensuing eons. Perhaps the Astromorphs eventually reached the pinnacle of evolution and became so advanced that it was impossible for them to advance any further. What goes up must come down. Some people seem to subscribe to this theory, but personally I can't get on board with it. The main reason for this being that the Asteromorphs lived within a zero-gravity environment encased within asteroids that they had hollowed out, whereas the alien author is clearly a terrestrial creature. It's possible that the later stage Asteromorphs decided to descend downwards and start to live on ordinary planets, but for the life of me I can't think of a reason for why they would want to do that. Of course, saying that, it's possible that the author is descended from the terrestrial variation of Asteromorph, which was genetically created by the true Asteromorphs to oversee the societies of the human-derived subjects, but I don't know. I don't think so. To me, this just doesn't ring true. I don't really have a solid explanation for my reasoning, if I'm honest. I just don't feel like it's a possibility. My instincts just aren't telling me that it's a possibility, and I feel deep down that the terrestrials and the Asteromorphs as a whole are not related to the author. Another possibility is that the author is a highly evolved subject. The subjects were the descendants of the Bugfacers, a small number of whom managed to survive the catastrophic war between the Asteromorphs and the Gravital's machine empire. When the Gravital embarked on their campaign of extermination, in which they wiped out all but a small number of the human-derived species, they had, for reasons unknown, decided not to completely wipe out the Bugfacers. The Gravital inducted them into the machine empire, but it seems more likely that they were simply kept as pets. They then genetically modified them in all kinds of ways, and the Bugfacers' descendants became what we call the subjects. The Gravitals, or at least a number of them, had over time grown extremely fond of organic life, and so they kept subjects as companions, and at times, machine and organic would fall in love with one another. With what could be perceived as a movement towards equal rights for the subjects over time, it could be that they eventually became fully autonomous and independent. It could be that the subjects, or at least some of them, parted ways with the machines and went off into the void of space to start their own empire. A billion years later, with all of this knowledge having long since become lost, the subjects could have evolved to become the author's species. I think this is possible, certainly more so than the author being descended from the Asteromorphs. Again, I'm only going by gut feeling and instinct here, as I don't think there is enough evidence to conclusively state which of these theories is true or not. Personally, I feel that in this case, the most straightforward theory is probably the most likely, in that the alien author isn't descended from humanity at all and is simply just another alien species. Intelligent alien species do exist in the All Tomorrow's universe, with the Q and also the Amphicephali being the obvious examples. So I feel like the alien author really is an alien author, with no genetic connection to humanity. Although there is the question of why the author has taken such an interest in the ancient human species. Is it just curiosity? Is it just an intense interest, the same way we have a fascination with dinosaurs? Or maybe he suspects that his species may in fact be descended from the human race and is searching for hard evidence of this. He doesn't know where his species came from, in the same way that we don't really know where our species came from, but he suspects that humans may have something to do with it. So this video is really just about getting a discussion going. I've made a few points, stated what I think may be the case with regards to the alien author, but I don't have the answers. None of us do. However, I am interested in reading your takes on what you think the author might be. Is he a Q? Is he an astromorph? Is he a bona fide alien? Or is he something else? Sound off in the comments below and let me know what you think. So how many of you All Tomorrow's fans out there have ever wondered what the Q's daily lives were like? I mean, outside of creating genetically engineered monstrosities. Well, I have often wondered about it. The thing about fictional villains, or even real villains, is that we like to think of their entire existence as being comprised only of the few things that were ever told about them. They do bad stuff, then go into a short hibernation until it's time to show themselves again and do more bad stuff. But that's just not how these things work. They're living, breathing things and have the intelligence to do all the things we do and more. The Q are probably no different. Now, I have done videos before where I've talked about looking at things from the Q's perspective and, of course, have been accused by a small handful of special people of defending the Q or justifying their actions. Well, I guess it's time to trigger a few more of these guys, because this is going to be another video where we take a look at things through the eyes of the Q. So first of all, what do we know about them? We know they like travelling through the cosmos and genetically modifying living things. We also know that they consider themselves to be the rightful rulers of the galaxy, and that they have their own religion. The fact that they're religious, fanatically so at that, is quite interesting because it shows that there is some depth to their existence. There is something more to their society other than going around doing mean things to star people. Some people are of the opinion that the Q are a hive mind and are basically just unthinking monsters, but I've often thought that, as is the case with our world, the average Joe or Joan in Q society might be more or less peaceful and never actually cause harm to anyone. They just want to get by in the society they were born into, with their rulers, like ours, being absolute scumbags who don't recognise any limits to their own power. It could be, as much as people hate the Q, that it's actually just a small handful of Q leaders calling the shots, and at some point they decided that their race was going to go around pwning any other civilization that they happened upon. And of course, some Q citizens will be for it, some will be actively against it, and some won't care either way. I'm sure some people will probably say that I'm humanising them too much, and maybe I am, but it's just a theory and a bit of fun, so try not to take it too seriously. Now, an ordinary Q in its daily life, as a part of the Q Empire, may be something like a pleb in the Roman Empire, just a worker who doesn't get paid an awful lot. If the Q use money, I mean they probably don't, but nobody can say for certain besides the author. They would have the equivalent of what we call a job, or maybe a set of duties that they perform on a daily basis, after which they go back to their dwelling and chill out. They're an intelligent species, so it could be that they do the whole friends and family thing like many humans do. Maybe they engage in leisure activities of some sort. I'm not saying the Q go bowling after work or play Xbox, but they could have things that they do to unwind, like reading the great works of literature by Q intellectuals of the past, or going for a peaceful flyabout near some picturesque areas of the planet they're living on. Or it could be something totally bizarre and out there that we can't even think of. I don't know, they're aliens. We also know that because of the creation of the hedonists, that the Q like to keep pets. As much as it may enrage some people to hear me say this, could it be that the Q have a softer side? If they have pets, of which they take great care, it could mean that the average Q has the capacity for empathy and is capable of caring for other living things. Most experts agree that empathy is a cornerstone of any intelligent race becoming successful in its evolution, so the Q would need to have had this at least at some point within their psychology and their history, and maybe they still do, even during the events of the book. And now, going back to the topic of religion, it could be that the Q regularly engage in rituals of worship. Maybe this is a weekly or even daily thing, where they worship their deity or deities and pay tribute to them in some way. The Q are living organisms, and as such they will need sustenance. The form this takes is unknown. Would they need water? Maybe, maybe not. They may also need food, but again, of what form this would take, we do not know. Maybe they drink liquefied nutrients that are created by rearranging the atoms of other harvested matter. Maybe they make their own meals from alien vegetation that they grow themselves. Maybe they eat raw star people flesh. Nobody knows. So with all of this in mind, we can surmise that the daily life of an average member of the Q race would involve eating, going to work, spending time with their friends and family, engaging in hobbies, looking after their pets, and engaging in religious practices, such as attending services in which they pay tribute to the ones they worship. Or maybe they don't do any of this and they're just grotesque space bugs that live in high-tech floating hives in outer space, buzzing around each other mindlessly, waiting for their masters to unleash them on another unsuspecting planet where they'll cause death, destruction and mayhem, destroying entire civilizations and giving a new meaning to the term body horror. The point is, I don't know. Nobody apart from CM Kozeman knows for certain. But the point of this video, as with many of my others, is to start a discussion among you guys. No doubt many of you will come up with some fascinating ideas and theories on what you think the Q's daily life was like, and I really look forward to reading them in the comment section below. At the end of All Tomorrows, the alien author confesses that every species and being that was mentioned in the preceding story were all, in fact, now extinct, having died out or migrated to another plane of existence over 1 billion years ago. This means that the alien author's account of the events is frankly pretty unreliable. All the author has to go by are billion-year-old artifacts and ruins, and he readily admits that the story is only just starting to come together, meaning that much of what is in the book is probably completely wrong. Of course, the level of technology possessed by the author's species would be unimaginable by us, and so that tech would have been put to use in unravelling the mystery of the bygone star people and all of their Q-created descendants. But, as I said before, the author has only just started piecing the story together, so that means whatever technology is being used is obviously struggling to give them the full picture. So with this in mind, I think it's safe to say that much of what the author has stated in his account of the events could be completely wrong. I mean, how accurately can you tell a story that happened 1 billion years ago? Another point I want to make is that early on in the story we're told that upon finding the Pandaravis, a creature that evolved from the Therizinosaurus of Earth, on an alien planet where it shouldn't have existed at all, the star people began to realise that something else was lurking out there in the galaxy, something that was highly intelligent and capable of taking living species from one planet and transporting them to others. Among some of the star people, this would resurrect religion, with many of them coming to believe it was a god or gods or godlike beings that were responsible for doing this. On this world, the world where the Pandaravis was found, the star people would likely have found pyramids which the Q were fond of leaving on the worlds they visited, and from there they have deciphered who these powerful beings were. If this made the star people, or a large proportion of them, begin to hold religious beliefs again, then it stands to reason that the star people had, in fact, begun to worship the Q. Now, this too could of course be incorrect, as everything in the book could be. Maybe that's not what happened at all and the alien author is wrong again. But for the sake of argument, we'll say that his theory about the star people becoming religious again after finding the Pandaravis is correct. After this discovery, the star people at some point came into contact with the Q for the first time. In the official account of the story, we're led to believe that it was a 1,000-year-long Q invasion of the star people worlds, in which they genetically changed them against their will and basically ruined humanity as it had come to be. But what if that interpretation of events is wrong? This is, after all, only what the alien author thinks happened. What if there is much more to the story? You see, I've been thinking about the fact that the star people had become religious and had probably started worshipping the Q. Maybe, just maybe, the Q turning up on the star people's doorstep wasn't a result of their travelling the galaxy in an evil, never-ending mission to remake the universe. Maybe the Q appeared because the star people had begun sending out communications into space in order to try and contact them purposefully, to try and get their attention. The Q were invited to the star people's homeworlds because the star people worshipped them. This could in fact be a very complicated story indeed, not just a simple systematic invasion, but a story of gods coming down to terrestrial worlds and meeting humanity. So I'm thinking that if this is the case, it could explain a few things. We know, if the author is correct on this point, that the Q were able to modify living things into anything they wanted them to be. The star people would have learned this from their exploration of the pyramids. So what if this had become a part of the basis of the new Q-centered religion? What if the star people, or those who had become religious fanatics who worship the Q, had invited the Q to their worlds because they wanted to be changed by them. They wanted to be modified into something else that the Q decided they should be. There would be no greater honour than to be changed by the gods themselves, and this is what the religious star people had desired most. So the Q were now visiting the worlds of the star people and were being deified and worshipped. Did the Q want this? Well, yes and no. Some of them would have just wanted to leave the star people worlds alone and let them grow out of these beliefs, whereas others, as was the case with the terrestrials who would come about much later in the story, grew corrupt and would take advantage of their worshippers. These Q individuals who had weaved offshoot religions around themselves, much like some of the terrestrials would later on, would be the ones to eventually change the star people into the varying new forms that we meet in the book. Some of these individuals would end up being much more cruel than others. This would explain such monstrosities as the colonials. Maybe the Q responsible for these forms had become displeased with their subjects and changed them in such a way as to punish them for being unable to live up to the insane demands that were placed upon them. Or maybe the Star People had grown so fanatical that they felt they were irredeemable sinners and they begged and pleaded with the Q to punish them. The Q, seeing just how desperately the Star People wanted this, and seeing no other way around this awful psychological problem that the Star People had developed other than outright destroying them, granted them their wish. Perhaps the Star People were threatening to wipe themselves out, and the Q, whom they worshipped, took immense pity on them, deciding that the best way was to just give them the fate they desired. This would also explain why the colonials' sentience had been retained. They wanted this. Afterwards, the Q, feeling so utterly miserable about how things had turned out and what they had had to do in order to prevent the Star People from destroying themselves, had left, being unable to face what they had done. There had probably been other ways around it, other modifications that could have been made to help the Star People, but the whole situation had become extremely messy and was horribly mismanaged. Such was the shame felt by the Q after all of this had transpired, that they simply left. So in summation, I would say that it's a distinct possibility that the Q and the Star People had coexisted for a long time before things just went horribly wrong. Or maybe it all happened a different way. I want to know what you think, dear viewer, so sound off in the comment section below. When we think of the Q taking over the planets inhabited by the Star People, we often think of violent battles, hostile invasions, and epic struggles for survival against a murderous alien menace. The majority of fan-made animations, stories, and illustrations depict the Q's takeover of worlds this way, but today in the first episode of Beware the Q's Wacky Theories, we'll be taking a look at an entirely different way it could have happened. But first, just a quick disclaimer to say that some of the things I say may be at odds with what is presented in the book. I'm aware of this, but let's remember that the book was written by an alien more than 1 billion years in the future, so he could have gotten some things wrong himself. Or at least that's my excuse for taking some major liberties with the story. Anyway, let's begin. So as I said before, perhaps the Q invasions weren't actually as dramatic as we're led to believe. What if, instead, the Q had a much more subversive way of taking over worlds? When you look at the illustration of the Q that we're presented with in the book, they actually don't look particularly imposing. They're giant bugs basically, and they don't even have legs. Sure, they would have technology on their side and sheer numbers as well, but unlike humans who have arms, legs, large brains, and quite often a thirst for blood, the Q actually look quite fragile. I know I'm making a lot of assumptions here, but the fact is we really don't know all that much about the Q, but looking at them, apart from being able to fly, they don't seem like they would have much of an edge on humans or the Star People. Could it be, in fact, that one-on-one battles and physical fighting weren't really the Q's style? What if, instead, they actually went about their invasions in a way akin to the reptilian race of aliens, also known as lizard people, who some say are actually pulling the strings today here on Earth? For those of you who don't know, the reptilian theory goes that a race of alien lizard people secretly control the world by taking on a human form and then gaining political power to manipulate human societies. Here's a thought. What if the Q never engaged in brute force shows of strength or all-out war on the Star People? What if the majority of Star People never even knew of the Q's existence at all? The Star People in charge, the rulers, would have known about them, but the average citizen had no idea of their existence at all. They were, in actuality, manipulators who remained in the shadows, secretly directing the Starmen civilization's destiny without them ever knowing. The Q would use their incredible abilities in bioengineering to first create members of the Q race who didn't look like the Q at all, but would look like Star People. These agents of the Q would then spend their lives living among the Starmen society, blending in and becoming members of their planet's elite. They would then subvert and secretly destroy the civilization they had infiltrated, reduce it to nothing, and then fully take over the world in question, and it would be at this point that they would begin to change the world's inhabitants into the weird new forms that we meet in the book. You're probably disagreeing with this this wacky theory right now, and I'm not surprised. You're probably wondering about certain things, like how it says in the book that the colonials were made into what they are because they had resisted 2 waves of Q invasion. Well, what if it wasn't an overt invasion, but the rulers of this world simply had more of a backbone than the rulers of other worlds, and when the Q secretly made themselves known to the Starmen in charge and told them that they wanted to take over and that they would be handsomely compensated for handing over the reins to the Q, they were told to GTFO twice. The third time, however, the Q decided to just steamroll over them, and knowing that the rulers here actually did care for their world's citizens, punished them by turning their people into horrifying flesh carpets. I know this theory is pretty out there, but given how little we actually know about what took place, I'm willing to bet that this theory could be how things went down. Possibly. But what do you guys think? Sound off in the comments below. Why did the Gravitals spare the bug faces? There are a few theories. The book states that it could be because the Gravital hadn't yet perfected their ruthless apathy, or that they may have taken pity on them. I'm not really convinced by these reasons, however. The Gravital, it seems, had had millions of years to perfect their absolute indifference to organic life. That's millions of years. Millions of years worth of emotional distance from their organic cousins. Millions of years worth of not recognizing their worth. Millions of years, perhaps, of anti-organic propaganda being peddled by Gravital leaders over countless generations. Despite their human minds, the Gravital were cold and calculating machines. It is for these reasons that I don't think the bug faces were spared for reasons such as pity, or the Gravital having any kind of fondness for them. And yes, the machines did eventually come to love the organics, but that itself took much time, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years of machines and organics once again sharing a society. If it wasn't pity that caused this race of machines to spare the bug faces, a mercy that wasn't imparted upon the other future human races that the Gravital discovered, then what was it? The other races were exterminated, swiftly and efficiently. But all of these acts of genocide took place after the machines had encountered the bug faces. If the machines had somehow developed a love of organics after meeting the bug faces, the first organic species they came across, then why did they wipe out all of the other species? Every single one of them, except for the bug faces. Curious. Well, dear viewers, I have a theory about why the bug faces were truly spared by the Gravital. The bug faces were spared because the bug faces were in actuality the most powerful future human species of them all. The bug faces hated the other future humans, and so I submit to you that it was this intense hatred, this xenophobia which we all know they possessed, this fear of their cousins on other worlds, which caused the bug faces to use the Gravital as their pawns to systematically destroy all of them. The Gravital found the bug faces, more like the bug faces found the Gravital, of whom they reprogrammed, forced them to go around annihilating the other future humans who they feared and despised, and then framed the machines as the aggressors in a campaign of all-out destruction and extermination. The bug faces were encountered by the Gravital first, but were never wiped out. They just happened to survive, whereas all of the other species did not. The other species whom the bug faces only reluctantly joined up with in the Second Galactic Empire after 40 million years of strained relations, a political union they wanted out of due to their anger at being made to work with other species that they wanted nothing to do with, and whom they wanted made extinct. And the bug faces just happened to be the sole survivors of a mass genocide of every organic species in the galaxy. It all just seems a little too convenient to me. What do you think?
What if the Q in All Tomorrows are actually the good guys? What if the Q are in fact the heroes of the story? While this very notion may seem like blasphemy to some of the more hardcore fans of the book, it seems like a distinct possibility to me for a couple of reasons. So what if the Q, in fact, are in the galaxy as watchers and, in a strange way, keepers of the peace? Now I know that in the book it states that the Q would invade planets colonized by the Star People, and that they would essentially be at war with the humans until they conquered them, but that is only the interpretation of an alien author who is a billion years removed from any of these events. And the author does state that we are only beginning to piece the story together. So what if things had in fact played out very differently than reported, and the Q weren't the evil entities that they're being portrayed as? Or at least their actions, which seem abhorrent to us humans, were not coming from a maniacal viewpoint of wanting to be the rulers of all life in the galaxy, but instead came from a perspective of thinking about the greater good. What if it was in fact the Q's mission to travel throughout the galaxy and seek out other species that seemed to be, if you like, getting too big for their boots and were getting ideas far above their station? Perhaps the Q would travel through the cosmos and find these species that were progressing too much in their view, and then revert them back to a primitive state so as to prevent any galaxy-wide disasters. It was stated in the book that even the Asteromorphs, the most highly evolved of the humans, still possessed the human trait of needing to expand and colonize. The Q were a billion-year-old race, and with time comes wisdom and knowledge, so they would likely have encountered many other advanced species in the galaxy in that time that they needed to genetically alter back into primitive forms, and had seen firsthand just how much damage these types of species could cause. It must be mentioned that while the Q did seem to wreak havoc on these human worlds and did cause much suffering, as is the case with the Colonials and the Mantelopes, who we'll talk about in a minute, they did seem to have at least some respect for human life, and would also allow some of the future human species to enjoy their lives and live peacefully, such as the hedonists and the fingerfishers. And the Q had allowed these humans to live, unlike the Gravital, who would, later on, simply wipe out any organic worlds they found. The Q had changed the Star People into a myriad of bizarre forms, but perhaps this was an effort by the Q to create different evolutionary paths of which perhaps one could potentially grow to become the next Q. A great many different forms being created increases the chances of a species becoming the heirs to the Q, the next ones who will be able to continue on with the Q's work of restoring balance in the galaxy and avoiding a galactic cataclysm. Indeed, the Mantelopes and Colonials did suffer horribly in their lifetimes, but what if the Q knew that millions of years of suffering would produce a truly enlightened species further down the line, one that would never dream of causing any suffering to other species once they reached the point of becoming an advanced species themselves? While the Mantelopes did perish, the Colonials would go on to become the Modular People, who would join the Second Galactic Empire, an empire of peace and unity. Yes, it is easy for us humans to look at the Q and think them evil for what they did, but we humans are guilty of the same such things. We kill animals to control their population, because if their numbers grow too large they'll cause much damage. But the Q were just doing the same thing, were they not?